Hello, Namaskar. This video is for those people who are trying to build a low cost FPV system, but somehow seem to get bogged down because almost all FPV systems out there use ELRS systems, and lots of people find ELRS radios to be quite expensive. So, what we have tried to do here is basically use the classic Flysky radio, the i6 or the i6x, which is far cheaper than any other ELRS system out there, and kind of put together the whole thing so that people can go around building a low cost FPV system using the Flysky radio. For this, what we'll be basically doing is using the Brahma Vishnu stack from Dark Matter. This is a brilliant stack that you get in the market at a very low cost. You've got the whole thing here, and we'll basically break up this whole process into a couple of steps where we'll first talk about the connection, the wiring, then maybe setting up the radio, and then flashing the firmware for this particular flight controller, and then doing the necessary configuration. So let's get down into it and see how this whole thing is done. So let's get down now to the first part of setting up this whole thing, which is basically like how to wire up and connect the system. What we'll be using in this case is your very cheap FS-i6b receiver. Now, the reason we have chosen IA6B is because it supports iBus. Please don't go in for the A model out here because you'll not be able to work with that. The other reason obviously is very simple. This is probably the cheapest receiver that you can buy out there, along with the typical FS-i6 or i6x Flysky radio system. Now let's try and see how to hook on this whole thing. So coming to the flight controller, what we have done here is basically taken one of these cables, 3-pin cables, which you can pull out from a burnt out ESC or whatever other source you might have. This cable basically has 3 lines. What we have done is taken the signal line, which could be yellow or white in your case, and soldered that to the R1 pad of the Brahma. Having done that, the brown or the black cable that you might have has been soldered to the ground pad of the Brahma, and the red cable, which is basically the power line, what we have done here is soldered that to the 4V5 pad and not the 5V pad. Now, the reason we have done that is very simple because for initial testing and setup, what we wanted to do was basically power up the receiver and the flight controller through a USB cable connected to the PC. And this seems to be the best way of doing that. Now, let's say we don't want to use that pad and want to use it for something else. We can very well move the power connection to the 5V pad, in which case the receiver will not be powered through the flight controller during the setup, and you'll have to postpone that for a later stage. Anyhow, so coming back to this, we've got these 3 pads soldered here to this cable. Now, how to hook this on to your receiver? What we'll be doing is, like we said earlier, using the iBus port, which is up here on the top right. What we need to do is take this cable with the signal line, which could be yellow or white, and keep it on the right side and just plug it in over here. And that's how we do it. Now, if we power up the receiver through a USB cable connected to the PC, we should be able to proceed with the setup, and the receiver should be able to get power from the flight controller itself. So next thing, let's try and see what needs to be done there to get this whole thing working. Okay, now we'll talk about the next part, which is basically setting up your radio to let it work or connect to the system. You obviously need to ensure that your receiver has been bound to your transmitter first. We have already gone ahead and done that in this case, and set up a model called the Brahma. You're free to use whatever name you want. The first thing we need to do down here is uh, go into the menu, system option, and sorry, go into the system option and set up the receiver. And this is how we do it. You basically go to PPM output down here and make sure PPM output is on. Having done that, we're going to need additional switches, remember, for setting your arming switch and your flight modes. So to do that, what we need to do is come down here, come to what we call the auxiliary channels and make sure these are set up for us. What we have done in this case is basically set up channel number 5 to switch number A, which is up here on the left, and set up channel number 6 to SWC, which is the 3-point switch available on the Flysky. This is the only 3-point switch we have, so we have configured that, and we'll be using that basically to control our flight modes. Obviously, before you do all this, make sure your receiver is bound to your transmitter. Let's get all this done and then move on to setting up the firmware on the flight controller and doing the necessary configuration. Okay, so moving on to the third part, where we'll be basically configuring the flight controller to basically work in the iBus mode. For that, what we have done is basically got Betaflight up here, taken a standard USB Type-C cable and hooked it onto the flight controller, which I'm going to keep aside over here. First thing to do over here is basically flash the firmware so that you get it right. For which what we need to do is basically unplug this and power up the flight controller in what they call the DFU mode. So let's see how to do that. On the flight controller, let's see if we can bring it into focus. On the flight controller, there's a boot button. What we need to do is keep it pressed. Keep it pressed and then plug in your USB cable. And what you should see on your screen now is the system has gone into what we call the DFU mode, which is like the mode where you can actually flash the firmware. Let's see how to do that next. Come down here on the menu, go to the firmware flasher option. The board we'll be selecting in this case is the Brahma. So let's see if we can find that. There. If you look at the options, we have Brahma F4 over there. This is the one we need to select. Come down, make sure no reboot sequence is switched on, and you are set up for full chip erase. Coming further down, this is where the critical part is. Radio protocol. We need to select iBus down here during the flashing of the firmware. So there you have it. Under radio protocol on the firmware flash screen, make sure you select iBus. Standard stuff like your ESC needs to be set on D-Shot. Having done this, let's try and fetch the firmware, for which you will need to click on the load firmware button at the bottom of the screen. We'll be loading this online. And if you look at the status screen now, it's trying to fetch that for us. Already gone and done that very fast. Once you have the firmware, the next thing to do is to actually flash it, for which again you'll see a button called flash firmware at the bottom right of the screen down here. So let's go ahead and click that. And again, if you look at the status, it started to erase the chip. We'll just wait for it to get over. It doesn't take too long. Patience, patience. Everything requires patience. This doesn't take too long. So let's wait for it to get over and do it together. Meantime, please make sure that you had selected these options that we saw earlier. There, I think it's done. Lovely, lovely. That was fast. So once it says programming successful, you're basically done. You can go ahead and disconnect the system, and like you're all set to go and do the configuration. Then that is exactly what we're going to be doing. I'll basically unplug the USB cable now on the side so that we can reboot the system and move on to the next thing. Okay, so for the next part, what we need to do is set up the flight controller, having flashed the new firmware, for which what we'll be doing is you've again got this whole thing connected. The receiver 2 has been connected now so that we can ensure that it's getting power. You take your standard Type-C USB cable and shove it into the USB port on your PC. And then what we do is go and click on connect on the top right of the screen. And bingo, there it's connected. What you should be seeing on the screen, let me see if I can try and zoom into that, is basically the correct firmware and the board version, which is what we are getting out here. We can very clearly see it's the dark matter Brahma, and 4.5.1 is the firmware that has been loaded. First thing to do, obviously, just like any other beta flight configuration, is to set up the accelerometer. So we'll just keep it steady, level, whatever way we can. Click on calibrate accelerometer. Having done that, let's straight away jump to setting up the receiver, because the other stuff people are like able to do on their own and is more or less standard. So we'll come down to this option called receiver on the left menu. Let's click on that. One important thing we need to do is set up the ports, which we haven't done. Since we are using R1, go to the port screen on the left side menu and make sure you switch on serial RX for UART1. That way, basically, we'll be using the serial connection on this pad R1 of your flight controller. Let's do that and save it by clicking on the bottom right of the screen down here. Done. We need to reconnect, obviously. So let's reconnect. And now jump into the receiver part. Out here, let's try and zoom in a bit and try and see what we have done. So what we have done here is, if you look at the right side of the screen, the receiver option we have selected is serial via UART, which you can see right on top. And below that, under what we see is called the protocol. So you have serial UART over here. And under the protocol, what we have selected is iBus. This is very important because what we are trying to do is configure a receiver to work in the iBus mode. Everything else is more or less standard, except for the stupid virus update. Anyhow, so everything else is more or less standard, and we should now be basically able to test and try and see if this whole thing works or not. So let's try and do that, for which we'll be needing a transmitter. It's obviously assumed that the receiver has been bound to your transmitter beforehand. Otherwise, this thing will not work. Now, if you bring this closer to our whole thing, if you now look at the receiver, it is getting power because we connected the power cable to the 4V5 pad. If we don't do this, remember, then you can't set up the receiver till your battery is connected. So having done this, let's try and see by switching on the transmitter if we are able to get this whole thing working or not. We zoom out a bit. Pick up the radio. I always advise people to switch on the transmitter first before you power on the receiver. So please try and do that for safety reasons. We have done that here in this case. Now let's try and see whether it works or not. Let's start with the roll stick. And there, if you look at the screen, we are getting the signal roll, pitch, throttle, and yaw. Bingo, it all works. Coming to the other switches that we set up, if you look at the arming switch and look at aux 1 down here, we should be able to see that moving, and there you have it. Switch number C. Remember, we configured this to channel 6 and we plan to use it for modes. So let's see if that is working. So I'll be moving that. And there on the screen, if you look at aux 2, we are getting a signal there also. All that remains then for you to do is basically go into the left menu again and make sure you configure your flight modes, which you'll find on the left screen again. Let's try and do it together maybe. What we need to do is, again, aux 1, remember, is being used for arming. So we'll say click on add range. Make sure it's moving. And maybe take 1300 to 2000 for it to be the armed mode. Let me just zoom out a bit so that we can see this whole thing. There you go. I'm moving the stick on the transmitter. So this is done. Next, we'll set up the other flight modes. Go to angle, add range. For this, what we need to do is select auxiliary 2 down here and set up the first range, which is around 1000 to 1500 types for the angle mode. Then come down to horizon mode. select the middle range, and third we leave it blank for the time being. Having done that, we need to save all of this, which is again done through the button on the bottom right, and you're good to go. Let's see if it all's working. No, arming doesn't seem to work because our range is slightly low. Did that. There. So arming works fine. Let's see if the modes change. Again, we seem to have a problem because our range is not correct. We're getting the angle mode, not getting the horizon mode. So let's again. That's because, sorry, we didn't select aux2 out here. Sorry, my mistake. Save that. And bingo, it works. Not very visible on the screen, but you can see this yellow bar jumping around, which tells you what your switch position is. Similarly for the arming switch, I mean, you'll see the thing out here. And now it's jumped to the extreme right. So we are all good to go. And that's about all you need to do to be able to set up your whole thing to use iBus on the Brahma Vishnu stack, which is, as it is, very low cost. And what we have tried to do over here is basically make it even cheaper for the rest of us to get into this very interesting hobby of flying FPV machines. Take care, all of you. All the best. Please do let me know in the comments if you face any difficulties.